All right, we are live. So, good morning, everybody. Lance Tarchioni back with you here on Ask the Agronomist from a new location today. So, I want to give a shout out and appreciate the folks here at Nutrient Ag Solutions, Macomb. Their beautiful new facility here south of Macomb. We've got a very nice conference room here today that they're allowing us to use. So, when the crew gets in, if they stumble in for breakfast here in the conference room, we may have a few interruptions. But hopefully we'll have a good session here this morning. So as always, please log in if you can with your YouTube account or a Gmail account or Google account of some kind, so that you can chat in your live questions. We've got producer Adam here with us this morning, making the trip up from Rushville to monitor the chat and also help me along the way here. And we always give priority to live questions as they come in. Adam and I have kind of got a list of things that have been we've been seeing out in the fields and people have been asking about the past couple of weeks. So fear not, we've got plenty of things to talk about, even if we don't get live questions. But always love the live questions. And if you do have thoughts, ideas, things that you want to hear us discuss on Ask the Agronomist, you can get those to your FSR or get them to myself or get them to us somehow. So feed that information into us. If you don't want to ask a question live today, send us an email, send us a text, and we can address it in an upcoming issue. So appreciate the moisture that we've gotten here recently. I know some of you have probably had more moisture than you needed or wanted. It is difficult to get too much rain in August, but it can be done. And hopefully you got what you needed, not more than you wanted, and avoided the storms that sometimes come with these thunderstorms. I was talking to a producer yesterday, kind of an unfortunate situation. He had 80-mile-an-hour winds and no rain. So that's always disappointing when you get wind damage and you didn't get any moisture to come along with it. So hopefully you have avoided those things. I know the little pocket of the world that I'm in, northern Fulton County, we actually, I was talking to Adam here before we started up this morning. He was surprised to hear we'd only had 1.8 inches of rain in July at our place, which I think most people had more rain than that in July. And we didn't. Our biggest rainfall event in July was 8/10, which was actually like July 10th. So at our place, I was very, very appreciative to get the moisture that we finally got yesterday. We picked up between 1 inch and 3 inches on our farms yesterday afternoon, which will finish the corn crop and go a long way towards maximizing the bean crop. I think the soybeans will benefit from additional rain later in August and even into early September, depending on when you planted your beans and what the maturity is. But beans are hard to judge. I know there's a lot of people that are very excited about the appearance of their corn crop. We've got a lot of really good color in the corn crop. We're going to talk about some diseases that are showing up, but by and large, the color and the appearance of the corn crop is as good as I've ever seen it at this time of year. I think in some cases that might be giving people, maybe falsely high expectations of how good the corn crop can be. So we'll talk about yield estimates and how to judge what the crop might be. Soybeans are even worse. Adam and I were joking this morning. I've never yield checked a field of beans that wouldn't make 100. And none of them ever have, by the way. So I was going through a little math here this morning and follow along with me and see if you think this sounds reasonable. So if you assume you've got 100,000 plants in a soybean field, which that doesn't sound like a lot, right? Most of you plant more than that. And let's say there's 60 pods on a plant, which people tell me all the time they find more than 60 pods on plants. And there is a little bit of a rule of thumb that a bushel per pod. So if you find 70 pods on a plant and you say that's an average plant, maybe those are 70 bushel beans. But we'll go through some math here. So we got 100,000 plants. We've got 60 pods per plant. We'll assume 2.5 seeds per pod, which you might argue that's too low, but we'll say 2.5. And we'll say 3,000 seeds per pound. So if you want to do yield estimates in soybeans, those are the figures that you have to have. You got to have plants, pods per plant, seeds per pod, seeds per pound. So if we do that, 100,000, 60 pods, 2.5 beans per pod, 3,000 seeds per pound. And you might say that's too low. You might say, oh, they'll be bigger than that. But even with those relatively, what most people would say, conservative figures, that would be 83 bushel per acre soybeans. I hope your soybeans are that good. I hope my soybeans are that good. I'd love to have some extra beans to sell to make up for the ones that I sold a year ago for 9 something a bushel. Soybeans are always tricky to guess. People will generally overestimate their population. They will overestimate their pod count. They will go, well, there's several 4s there, and I don't see too many 2s. So let's say there's an average of 3 seeds per pod there. There's probably not a soybean that's ever averaged 3 seeds per pod, but it's tempting to say that they're there. And then seed size makes a huge difference. You can say, well, they were 2,600 when I planted them, so let's say they're going to be 2,600 when I harvest them. And that's how you get yield checks in soybeans easily exceeding 100 bushel on a field that makes 68. So soybeans will make a monkey out of you. So I yield check my soybeans with combine with a properly adjusted yield monitor is the way I like to yield check soybeans. So we'll talk more as we get along here through the program. But again, chat in your questions. Be thankful for the growing conditions that we've had, and I hope that we finish strong here. We're getting close on corn. A lot of corn starting to dent. We're probably 3 weeks or less away from black layer in a lot of corn, and so the days of either adding or subtracting yield from our corn are coming to a close here relatively soon. Once we reach black layer, nothing more good or nothing more bad is going to happen at that point from a yield perspective. So if we can keep that plant, healthy, well watered, well fed, to black layer, that's going to maximize the yield potential and make the best we can out of it. So, Adam, what's on your mind here this morning?
Well, like I said, Lance, always appreciate any questions that we can get. Back to the soybean you were talking about with the yield estimations. I mean, you and I were talking, and I've noticed, you've noticed, I think probably several people have noticed that we do have quite a bit of opportunity, it looks like, up the top of the soybean plant, which, when we tend to have pretty good potential with our soybean crop, the top of the plant's usually the icing on the cake.
Right.
So,
right.
I think there's some reasonablement in being cautiously optimistic with what the soybeans might actually end up producing versus, I know what I personally have been a little bit more pessimistic on the soybeans so far this season.
I have saddened many a person this summer with my expectations for this year's soybean crop. I've been a little bit of a Debbie Downer on the soybeans. Soybeans do not like wet feet. There was not a good-looking field of beans anywhere in my territory back in June, and they have recovered marvelously since then. I hope they're somewhere near as good as they look now. It does appear that they're going to end up being a whole lot better than it looked like they were going to be a couple months ago. But I'm still leery that they can be as good as they've been the past couple years, considering what they went through this summer. I will say, to Adam's point, a lot of your former boss, Dr. Belo, has done a lot of this work looking at where does the yield come from in a soybean plant. The majority of the yield in a soybean plant is not at the top. So even when you get those big clusters, and even when you see it, wow, that looks impressive. I love seeing them too. But if the majority of your pods are at the top of the plant, that's probably not good, because the middle of the plant is where the bulk of the yield is coming from. And I hope that we've got that icing on the cake with a lot of cake. I don't like all icing. I like cake primarily. So the cake is in the middle part of the plant, a little bit of icing on top. If you got all icing and no cake, that's just putrid. So we don't want that. But I will say that I was in some of my beans over the weekend, walking out to get the one water hemp plant that I could see close enough to go get. And there was a cluster of blooms at the top of that plant, probably as profuse as I've ever seen, they were packed in there so tight, you would have had to have, damaged them to count how many different blooms were there. And I hope I got this rain in time to, save most of those. And I hope I get one more rain later this month to help fill all those. But those were April planted 3.7, 3.8 beans, and they're still blooming. So, there's a lot of potential left to add yield to all these soybeans. We still have not determined, how many seeds are going to abort out of pods. We have not determined how many pods are going to abort. We have not determined, how many of these late flowers we can fill. We have not determined what the seed size is going to be in the pod. So there's a lot of room to go up or go down on what soybean yields can be from here on out. And, we've always, kind of the rule of thumb's always been that August makes or breaks a bean crop. With the early planted soybeans that we do these days, July has become, probably equally important. Most people had good moisture in July. So far, most people have had good moisture in August. The sunlight issue, I'm still nervous about solar radiation. I don't know how many of you have had somebody saying that they didn't think their sweet corn was all that super sweet. Well, Adam, where does sugar come from?
Photosynthesis.
Sugar comes from photosynthesis. Where does photosynthesis come from?
The sun.
Sunlight. So I still, I don't know. It would be really weird if a lack of solar radiation ends up being a yield limiting factor in Central Illinois. But strange things can happen, and we'll see what the what the crop turns out to be. We'll be harvesting somewhere in 3 weeks probably, and on some of the early corn, and so we don't have to wait too much longer to find out what kind of yields we're going to have. But I still think we've got a really good crop out there, whether it meets expectations or not. I know some of you guys, some of your expectations are ridiculously high, and it's hard to meet a ridiculously high expectation sometimes.
Yeah, we'll see with the soybean. It's an interesting situation, but I'm feeling like you said, a little bit better than what I was earlier.
Yeah.
The soybean crop might not be too bad. So
yeah.
Let's you mentioned a little bit about how we do soybean yield estimations.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the same process with corn,
right?
But maybe you could go into a little bit of your strategy and process as to how to do the corn yield estimations.
Yeah.
Guys are walking around looking at corn pretty hot and heavy right now.
Yeah.
Probably a lot more next week because the weather's supposed to be a little bit more
next week. I've been trying to avoid cornfields myself this week, Adam. So although sweating in a cornfield would be good for my physique, but it's not been pleasant out there with the humidity. So yeah, corn yield estimates are, a little easier to do, a little more fun to do, a little more common to do. We can miss those by a mile as well. And I'm to be honest with you, I'm not a big pre-harvest yield check kind of guy, because my attitude's always been, real soon you're going to have the real number. And the estimated number can be off 60 bushel one way or the other. And, I always try to guess low just because I like to be pleasantly surprised. I insulted a guy one time that, thought he had some 300 bushel corn. I guessed it at 265, and he was kind of mad at me because he thought I was insulting him. And it did end up being better than 265. Didn't make 300 though. So anyway, if you're going to do yield checks in corn, the first thing you need is an accurate ear count. And this is where one of the places we go astray on our corn yield checks, because, you planted 35.7. And so you figure, maybe there's 35,000 ears out there. Well, there's not. And if there are, they're not 35,000 as big as the one you picked to do your yield check. So we need an accurate ear count, which takes more than one count to get an accurate ear count. We need to get an average sized ear. I usually try to pick smaller, I try to pick ones that look a little lower than average size because, it's just easy to pick the nicest ear you see. Good way to do it is to take like several consecutive ears, and even if you get a runt in there, don't throw it out. Use that one in your count. So you need a ear count, you need an average size ear, count kernel rows, count length. I don't count clear out to the tip. So, you're not going to get all those kernels off the tip. So, you don't want to count the longest row you can find on the ear. There's just lots of ways through the process that you can overestimate your yield. And then we get down to the kind of the biggie that everybody always asks about is what's your factor? Most standard formulas use 90,000 kernels to make a bushel. It rarely takes 90,000 kernels to make a bushel. So you can, get as low as, I've seen some fields that probably 65,000 kernels made a bushel when you've got huge, heavy kernels. And if you're in a drought situation or you've got a hybrid that's extremely girthy. So the other thing that I get frustrated with on formulas is the formula doesn't factor in, is it a 22 row ear or is it a 14 row ear? Because you can have the same, I'll tell you a little secret. You can have the same amount of yield on 22 row ears and 14 row ears. The way you do that is the 14 row ear kernels are vastly bigger than the 22 row ear kernels. And that's how you get the same amount of yield. So girthy ears are fun. Girthy ears yield check well. Slender ears typically do not yield check well because people don't manipulate the factor. So if you want to get really precise with this, you should use a lower factor on slender ears and a higher factor on girthy ears, just because you are not, unless you're, if you're raising 600 bushel corn and you're going to win the NCGA yield contest, you might have as big a kernel on a girthy ear as you do on a slender ear. But even that guy probably does not, because the plant's going to compensate. And one of the ways the plant compensates is if there's fewer kernels on the ear, they're going to be bigger. If there's more kernels on the ear, they're going to be smaller. So I usually use something 80, 85-ish for my factor. If things have been perfect, you can go lower. If things have been bad, you should probably go higher. But do a stand count, and stand doesn't matter. Ears matter. So we don't need a stand count. We need an ear count. You need an average ear size, add up your kernels, decide what factor you're going to use, and that'll get you within plus or minus 30 bushel, hopefully, of your yield. But if you ever want to see what difference the factor makes, do the math sometimes and just compare. It's easy to swing the yield 60 bushel just playing with the factor. So a change in the factor from 90 to 70 is a huge impact on your yield calculation. So that factor is pretty important. I don't know, with the sunlight conditions we've had, I don't know how big the kernels are going to get. I don't know how deep the kernels are going to get. I don't know how much weight we're going to be able to pack into those kernels. Could that be where the surprise comes from? Could this be a year where it takes 85 or 90 to make a bushel and you're all doing yield checks figuring it's going to be 70 or 75 because the corn's so green and how much rain we've had? I don't know. Combines will tell. But if you want to do yield checks, that's the way I'd do it.
Yeah. I still anchor back to, you're talking about ear count, population, which obviously correlates to ear count. That's one factor that's usually a consistent in the yield component yield estimation method. And so that's one reason why, we're always talking about what population you're planting your corn at.
Right.
Obviously,
Right.
Kernel number and kernel weight can do some flexing, some give and take both directions. But the number of ears you got is the number of ears you got.
That's right.
So if you don't have enough ears, plant's capability to flex with the number of kernels and the kernel weight is limited to a certain extent. And maybe you want to talk a little bit about what we should be trying to evaluate out there, maybe by looking at our ears currently to say, where we're at this year, with our populations, our stands, and expectations for yield.
Yep, and you're probably thinking about the the infamous tip back And everybody loves to see, that big full, that ear that you want to walk into the grain elevator with and slap it down on the counter and go, there's what my corn looks like. And you usually don't want to do that if you got 2.5, 3 inches of tip back on that ear, because that looks like you've failed, and look at all that lost potential. And what we really want to focus on is the kernels that are alive on the ear rather than the kernels that are dead on the ear. And that's what tip back is. Those are aborted kernels that plant could not fill. So if sunlight's a factor, if lack of moisture is a factor, if lack of nutrition is a factor, if really, really hot nights, has anybody went out this week at 10 o'clock to take the trash out, and you walk to the dumpster and back and your shirt is soaked? That's partly because I'm a big fat guy and I sweat a lot, but it's also because it's like 98% humidity and it's still 83 degrees at 10 o'clock at night. So those are stressful nights for a corn plant. That corn plant is suffocating a little bit out there in the field under those conditions. Corn would ideally, if you want to know what corn likes, and you've ever wondered why places like Washington State typically have some of the highest average corn yields, partly because they've got few acres and they're irrigated and they're highly managed acres. But they also have a lot of days where it's 86 and sunny, and then it's 58 that night. Gets really cool at night. So that would be perfect growing conditions. So we're not ever having perfect growing conditions typically. Generally, if we've got moisture and we've got good fertility, regardless of how hot it is at night, we're going to raise good corn. But it would be better if it was cooler at night.
No doubt. But yeah, I always like to see a little bit of tip back when I'm walking around out there in the field. And obviously, You never know what your potential is going to be when you start out the season as far as what population to plant or put down in the ground. But you mentioned Dr. Belo, and one thing that he always said that I believe is, high yields, great yields don't come without planning for them.
Right. So. Right. Yeah. It's, I really don't, want to be in a field that has no tip back, because then we just know we left yield on the table. We didn't have enough ears out there to maximize yield. Yeah, it looks nice. But if you're seeing some tip back, you at least know you got all you could get. Now, if you're seeing an alarming amount of tip back, now that could mean was our population too high? It obviously was for that environment. Now, that doesn't mean that you're losing yield versus what a lower population would have given you. A lower population would have given you a prettier ear, but it wouldn't necessarily have given you more bushels. So especially with modern hybrids, we rarely see yield decreases from excessively high seeding rates. You get smaller ears, but you'll typically get as many bushels per acre. So the risk actually is greater of having not enough ears than it is of having too many ears. Now, we can affect standability, harvestability. There are other things that can come along with having too high a population. But if you look at our population studies, where we're trying to make specific hybrid specific seeding rate recommendations, there's a bell curve with all of those. And there are occasions where that bell curve drops on the other side of the bell curve, and you might have a 15 or 20 bushel yield hit at super high seeding rates. But those are way higher than anybody is going to go typically. Every year I get that call of, I goofed up, I had sprocket set wrong on the planter and got the first field planted and didn't realize I was planting 72,000 until I got done or ran out of seed too early. If you're in one of those situations, there could be a yield decrease from that. But if you plant 38,000 and 34 was all you needed, you're going to get just as much corn out of 38,000 as you would have 34. Now, the ROI obviously is better at 34 than 38 in that scenario. But to Adam's point, if you plant 34 because you think some seed salesman was just trying to take advantage of you and get you to buy some more seed, recommending 37.5, and you walk out there at 34,000 and you've got 32,000 ear, planted 34, you got 32,000 ears, and the kernels are pushing each other off the tip of the ear. That tells you that we're losing yield because we don't have enough ears.
So a lot of yield estimations going on. We're getting closer and closer to harvest, Lance, but there are some people considering still doing some more with fungicide.
Yes. Yep.
A lot of fungicide sprayed this year.
Right.
Some fields that would have liked to have had fungicide on them in a few cases that just actually couldn't logistically get done. That's how much fungicide demand there was. But let's talk a little bit about some people who are walking around looking at their crop, looking at their corn in particular, and saying, is there any good reason to spray another fungicide, even though we've already put one on at VT-ish time frame?
Right. So it's been an interesting year for fungicides. There's been more fungicide sprayed this year probably than ever. There were guys that did an early application, like with the herbicide at V5, V6, and then we've got a pretty wide window of applications around tassel. So there's a few couple new products on the market that are actually promoting pre-tassel applications of fungicide. And then we had a lot of acres that, just because we were trying to cover so much, actually got on, brown silk even later than brown silk in some cases. So that VT window is basically from shoulder high corn to R3 this year. So that's a huge window. So depending on where you were at in that window, you may be seeing different things in your field. So I think in some cases we sprayed a field a little on the late side that was clean visually, but had infections that you could not see. And then those infections went ahead and developed into lesions that were visible. And so it appears as though you've got new disease infection, relatively soon after spraying your fungicide, which probably not the case. If you used a good fungicide and it was applied correctly and it has the ability to control the disease that you're seeing, if you're seeing disease lesions within a couple weeks of that fungicide application, I'm going to say that was an infection that had already happened before you applied the fungicide, and then the lesion just developed to the point where you could see it. So I think in some cases we're seeing, some infections that had already occurred. Most fungicides are only going to give you, I'm going to say, 2 to 3 weeks of disease protection or prevention. And then that disease is going to start to, sporulate again. It's going to start to cause new infections. It's going to be a couple weeks before those new infections show visual lesions. And typically the way fungicides work is we don't truly get season-long protection out of a fungicide. The fungicide breaks the disease cycle, stops the infections from occurring for a period of time. And by the time the disease can start to reinfect again, we've moved into a different weather environment that's not as conducive for that disease, or we're close enough to harvest that the disease doesn't have time to cause a lot of damage and affect yield. And I think that's where we're at with a lot of these late season diseases that are showing up. Most of this corn crop is starting to dent. We're within 3 weeks of black layer on a lot of acres of corn. And it would be difficult, in my opinion, for even an aggressive disease like tar spot or southern rust to get bad enough fast enough to significantly impact yield. Now, notice that word significantly. That doesn't mean that these late season diseases aren't going to take yield from you. And if you don't want to sacrifice any yield whatsoever, there may be some fields that would benefit from a sequential fungicide application. I know those are going on in a few limited cases with some really aggressive producers that, they see a really good potential in their crop. They've got it sold for a really good price. They've got it figured out that, I only got to get 6 bushels, let's say, to break even on this application. And I know how bad southern rust can get, and I've heard how bad tar spot can get. I've got them both in the lower canopy. I'm not willing to risk it. I want to make sure that upper canopy stays healthy. So that's the risk reward that you're weighing of making a sequential application. Honestly, I think if you want to be an uber aggressive corn grower and consider making 2 applications of fungicide late season. So let's leave the V5, V6 stuff out of this. I'm talking about 2 applications during grain fill. If you think that that's something that, you might be interested in, your VT application needs to be early. I'm going to say if you want to do 2 shots of fungicide during grain fill, something right at tassel followed by maybe a late R2, early mid R3. So basically, if you spray at tassel time and you spray at roasting ear stage time, roughly, that would be a pretty good time to put a 1-2 punch fungicide on out there. I don't think we want to make a habit out of spraying fungicides at dent stage in corn. That's too late for there to be a significant benefit. So if you want to play around with 2 shots of fungicide, I think that first one needs to be out there when you see tassels or before. And the second one needs to be a lot earlier than right now. I just think we're probably too close to black layer in most cases. Now, if you've got late planted corn, really full season corn, other circumstances, if you've got corn that's only at R3 now, there's a lot of time for a disease to impact that crop. The other thing that I like to remind people is, I don't so much care what's going on in the lower canopy. Now, the lower canopy can be a source of inoculum to infect the upper canopy. And whatever disease you see out there today is going to get worse between now and black layer. So I'm not saying it's not going to get worse. So if you go out there once a week and you look at the same plant every week, you will see more lesions on that plant next week than you saw this week. And that progression will continue as we get closer to harvest. Tar spot in particular tends to infect a lot more rapidly and a lot more aggressively as the plant begins to senesce. So I think we're going to see a lot of tar spot and a lot of corn at harvest time. I'm not sure it was bad enough early enough to be a significant yield impact, but there's probably going to be some people that get a little bit spooked at how much tar spot they see in their corn at harvest time. It was very easy to see at harvest time a year ago, and we've got more tar spot out there at this time this year than we did at this time last year, in my opinion, at least in some of the fields I've been in. So I do think I think tar spot will be pretty noticeable. Back to my keeping the upper part of the plant healthy. So if the upper part of the plant from the ear up is healthy, I'm not really concerned about how much disease I'm seeing on the lower leaves. Now, the trick is, if you say, well, I'm not going to spray until the upper part of the canopy, is showing a lot of disease. The catch-22 in all this is, if you wait until the upper part of the canopy is showing a lot of disease, that's too late to stop it. We need to prevent it rather than stop it. Now, a product like Delaro with the triazole that's in Delaro, with the triazole load that's in there, it is one of the better products to use in a situation where disease has already started. But even Delaro works better preventing disease than it does stopping a disease that's already started. So the trick is, that's the frustrating thing to me about fungicides is you have to somewhat predict or estimate or have some faith that I'm going to do this today to prevent what might happen 2 weeks from now. Because if I wait 2 weeks to see if it really happened or not, then I've missed the opportunity to prevent it from happening. So it makes IPM with fungicides really, really challenging because you don't know how many infections are there that you can't see. You don't know how many infections are going to happen next week. You can look at the weather, you can look at the disease. So the disease is in your field. The lower leaves are full of it. You can look at the weather, and if it's, favoring a particular disease, you can assume that more infections are going to occur, but you don't really know how fast it's going to spread. You don't know how bad it's going to get. But you do know that if you wait till it's already bad, then you've missed the opportunity to do something about it. So that's why a few guys have decided to make another application in corn. I would encourage you to split some fields, see what you can learn from those applications, see if you see a benefit from it. The other factor that people talk about is, what about stock quality? Well, you will absolutely, have better stock quality if you use a fungicide. Can you still improve fungicide or stock quality with a late fungicide application? Yes, you probably can. Do you need to? That's the $1 million question. But that plant will do all it can do to protect all the yield it's got. And so before it gives up a bushel, it's going to rob nutrients out of the stalk. So you can have plants that cannibalize their stalk and maintain full yield. So you might see situations where, yeah, maybe the yield was only 3 bushel better from my late R4, early R5 fungicide application, but it had better stalk quality. And that's another way that people justify making that investment. The other thing I would mention is if you're going to do a late application, make sure you're using a product that controls these diseases that have the potential to get bad late. So southern rust and tar spot have been the primary focus. Well, your lesser expensive products are not very good on southern rust and tar spot. So you can't really go out there with a low cost fungicide or find a generic strobe or generic triazole, or you're talking about a 2 or 3 product premix, a premium product. So if you're going to do something that's going to help, you're going to be looking at one of the high tier premier products out there, and so it's going to be a relatively expensive application to make if you want to prevent late season tar spot and late season southern rust. The last thing I'll leave you with is just a word of caution. You've probably heard agronomists say before a lot, it depends. And you're probably thinking I didn't give you really solid, concrete recommendations of what you should do in this case. Anybody who is, I wouldn't trust that person very much, because there's no way to know whether you absolutely really need to do something or you absolutely should not even consider doing anything. There's just a lot of factors that are moving parts. The disease, the weather, the price of the grain. Every year we're in a situation that we've really never been in before, and so I would say, I can't tell you for sure whether you should be considering another application of fungicide or not. I can say you should use fungicide. If you didn't do one earlier in the season, there's probably no point in doing one now because you've got so much infection that's already occurred in that plant. You can't prevent as much as the guy who did use a fungicide earlier and probably has a healthier, cleaner plant that still, is worthy of protection at this point. So a lot of variables, a lot of unknowns, a lot of interesting things to talk about, a lot of interesting things to play around with. I have a hard time getting guys to split fields, do check strips. I know it's, a check strip with a plane. Don't do that. You can't really do you could spray a strip. Don't try to leave a strip, because leaving a small strip is not generally very effective. If you want to split a field, I like to go crossways. If you got a yield monitor, spray on a diagonal. Leave a significant untreated area in a field if you want to learn. Now, sometimes we don't want to learn. If I spend $38 an acre doing something, do I really want to know that it gave me 0 additional bushels? That might be frustrating. And if you do compare something, I will admit this, I like people making comparisons. I love comparisons because I'm an agronomist, but I'll be the first to admit that what you see this time doesn't have any bearing on what you might see next time. So you can't necessarily, do something today, get a +10 or a 0, and walk away from that experience going, okay, now I know what I need to do next time. Well, you really don't. You might falsely think you do, but every year's different. Every situation's different. Every hybrid's different. The environment's different. Even in my territory, I've been in unsprayed fields of corn that I have a very difficult time finding disease in. And that'll frustrate the heck out of some of you that, put on a good fungicide 3 or 4 weeks ago, and you're looking at an alarming amount to you of tar spot and rust in your corn, and versus the guy that maybe didn't spray anything and his stuff's still pretty clean. So it varies a lot with environment. The environment that I've had on some of my farms is not as conducive to disease because we've been drier. If you've been in an area that it's really never quit raining, that's probably a little more favorable for disease development. Generally speaking, I'm still somewhat shocked at how little gray leaf spot we're seeing. I thought we had pretty perfect weather conditions for gray leaf spot, but apparently gray leaf spot knows something that I don't know, because the weather conditions obviously weren't as conducive to gray leaf spot infection as I thought they were, because we're just not seeing a lot of gray. Almost no northern. The only northern I've seen all year was in sweet corn. Very hard to find northern corn leaf blight. A little bit of common rust, but not too much. So primarily my questions are coming on tar spot and southern rust. And those are two diseases that do have the potential to get bad late. And so that's what's kind of fueling some of these conversations about, should I be making another application?
Yeah, a lot of good information there, Lance. And, I think I wouldn't mind pointing out as well that whether you're seeing a lot of disease or whether you're not seeing a lot of disease, I mean, even within our footprint, the dynamics of the weather environments dictate a lot of differences out there.
Yeah.
I do have some areas in my territory that the corn didn't get sprayed, got sprayed late, and gray leaf showing up pretty good.
Yeah.
But I can go to other places in my territory, just like you said, maybe not have a fungicide been applied yet,
right,
and stuff's pretty clean still. So there's a lot of dynamics that take place out there, and I wouldn't necessarily tell anybody to be too disheartened by the fact that if they sprayed a fungicide, have disease, versus the guy who didn't spray the fungicide, doesn't have disease, that guy who didn't spray the fungicide couldn't have still gotten a yield boost from applying that fungicide. You're talking purely from a disease control standpoint versus an offensive or pushing yield, protecting yield perspective.
I mean, those of you listening that know how healthy some of our disease shield hybrids are, so a 6434, for example, very rarely will you see enough disease in 6434 to make you think it needed to be sprayed. Yet we've oftentimes seen it yield 20 bushel or more better when it does get sprayed. So Adam's absolutely right. You can't tell how much of a yield increase you're going to get from fungicide based on disease pressure. Now, that frustrates pathologists, because pathologists would like there to be a correlation between disease pressure and yield increases from fungicide. But because of the strobies and the plant health benefits and the other ways that fungicides can increase yield, that relationship there's still a relationship there, but it's not a direct relationship like it used to be. Back in the old days, when all we had was tilt or a triazole of some kind, there was more of a direct relationship between disease incidence and severity and yield. But with newer products, with the strobies, plant health benefits, and other ways that we can improve yield with a fungicide, that correlation is not quite as direct as it used to be.
Yeah. And one thing too, I think that's probably sparking some of these second application of fungicide and corn talks this year is we're planting more and more soybeans early. And we're doing that partly because we're going to start harvesting those soybeans earlier to try to take advantage typically of the weather and the environment that, being able to harvest soybeans earlier would give you versus being harvested later. So I think guys are thinking a little bit more about sustainability as well as potential yield benefits from that second application. And that's driving some interest and some potential for these trials, these efforts to be done. And like you said, I never like to discourage any type of opportunity for someone to learn something, try something, see what we can do. Never know what's going to work next year or not, though, right? Just because next year is always different. I like what you said about every year we're always almost in a situation we've never been in before, and to some extent. But great conversation on that. But we've got a question that came in from Dirt Doctorful, and it's a good question. It's actually I sent him a chat back. Appreciate the question, and then it's something that you and I were touching on a little bit this morning. His question is, we had 4 inches of hard rain that lodged some beans a few days ago. How much will that lodging reduce yields at this stage?
So I'm going to say at this stage, probably not a lot, in my opinion. I think the earlier beans lodge, the more potential there is for yield loss. There is probably always some potential, although it varies a lot. I've seen some beans, some of mine, some of competitors that lodge terribly and are still extremely high yielding soybeans. Now, you could make the argument that if you could magically make that bean stand better, would it have higher yield potential? But you can't necessarily judge a bean's yield potential by its standability. Standability is something we like in soybeans. If it significantly affects that plant's ability to capture sunlight and perform photosynthesis, then yeah, you're going to have, maybe some yield loss associated with that. But if that crop canopy is still healthy and those leaves are still healthy and those leaves are still functioning, I think most of the yield potential on that plant will go ahead and fill. Where you lose yield on soybeans, we've already kind of talked about this. You can abort blooms, you can abort pods, you can abort seeds in a pod, and you can make the seed smaller. So there are plenty of different avenues that plant has to lighten the load on that plant, so to speak, if it's feeling stress. I'm going to say that, even though a 1.5 inch rain with no lodging would have been ideal, a 4-inch rain with lodging is probably better than no rain. So I still think that plant, that field is going to benefit from that moisture, because we probably needed the moisture. Don't know how dry you were, but in my case, I'll take the bigger rain than I needed, and I'll take the lodging versus not getting any moisture. So I wouldn't be terribly concerned about it. I also think that a lot of these soybeans that get lodged in a weather event will stand up pretty well after the leaves come off in a lot of cases. So we've definitely gotten a lot of beans that, and this happens, it seems like this happens frequently. It wasn't too long ago, Adam, it seems like we had people that were complaining, my beans aren't even knee high yet. I can still see the corn stalk rows in my no-till beans. These things are so short, they're never going to amount to anything. And now they're up to my chest. And it just seems like that happens a lot. And we've got some big beans out there in some places, especially if they were planted early, got off to a good start. We're in a part of the state that didn't get too wet. I've still got a lot of beans at home that aren't waist high. So not all beans are super tall, but they're all a hell of a lot taller than it looked like they were going to get a couple months ago. And so when you get beans, Adam and I were joking about, one of our beans, one of my favorites, 38XF1, that thing, it doesn't stand perfectly, but for as tall as it is, it's amazing how well it stands. If you could take a foot of height off of that thing, we'd rate it a 1 for standability, because at 5 feet tall, it still stands. But it'll get a little leany on you sometimes, as any bean will when they get that tall. And I don't necessarily like 4.5, 5 foot tall beans. Kind of a favorite old saying of mine's, 80 bushel fodder, 40 bushel beans. There is not a correlation at all between height and yield in soybeans. Now, do they look good? Absolutely, till the day they go down. And then those tall beans become long beans. And it's nice to look at tall beans, not as nice to look at long beans.
Thanks again for the question.
Appreciate the question. Yeah,
absolutely. Thanks there, Dr. Cole. So next question, I guess we'll kind of progress through the season here. And I've gotten this question, I know you've had it tons of times over the year, but when's the best time to start trying to harvest my corn? I know that there's a lot of variables that go along with that, depending on what sort of whether you got a drying operation, and what sort of incentives the elevator's offering, all kinds of different things, right? But from maybe from an optimum yield potential standpoint, that's usually what it comes down to.
Right. Well, that's an easier question to answer, because if you're talking economics, then you got to factor in, what are your drying costs? What's your ability to handle wet, moisture corn? If you just talking yield, that's easy. The highest yielding corn is going to be the wetter harvested corn. And typically, as we go through harvest, yields will slowly decline. That's a combination of more harvest loss, which is what drives that primarily. And then phantom yield loss is a real thing. Now, it's not the primary driver of decreased yield as grain dries down in the field. There's just more head shelling. There's more now with some of the newer corn heads and some of the attachments that are out there. Guys can prevent that. But you just get a few more ears flying out of the head. You get a little more shelling at the head. You get a little more stalk lodging, and every now and then you run over that stalk and you don't pull that ear in. So the vast majority of yield decline as the crop matures in the field is just greater harvest loss. But then you add on top of that phantom yield loss, which there's been a lot of work done on that. It is a real thing. That kernel is still respiring. That kernel is a live organism. And that kernel does, burn up a little bit of its weight, so to speak, just in the process of being a live organism. So, 23 to 25% is kind of what some people would say is the ideal compromise spot, because above 25, it's not going to yield a lot more, but you do get into significantly more drying costs. As you get below 23, we're going to start to lose yield faster. My dad was kind of old school when he was still farming. He loved harvesting 16.5 corn, putting it straight in the bin, saved lots of money on drying. Never bothered him at all because he didn't know how much more it would have yielded if we'd have taken it out at 23. He just loved saving the money, taking it out at 16.5. We have a lot of corn that gets too dry, frankly, by the time we get it out of the field. Adam and I both, all of our reps, all of our dealers, deal with frustrated people every year that, they're seeing some eardrop or they're seeing some stock lodging. We don't look at those kind of complaints in 22% corn. We're looking at that in 14% corn that's been sub 20 for a month in the field. And Adam was talking about the logistics of harvest, and you're going to do beans first, you're going to do corn first, you're going to switch back and forth, you're going to do all your corn, then you're going to do your beans. A lot of that is depending on your personal preference and how your operation's set up. But I will say that it is a challenge, virtually impossible, to be honest, to harvest every acre of everything at the proper time. Something's going to have to wait. Are you more comfortable letting the beans wait? Are you more comfortable letting the corn wait? A couple of years ago, we were worried we were going to have a lot of lodging in corn, so a lot of people let beans wait. Figure, well, the beans not going to fall over like the corn might fall over, and they haven't been ready long enough that I'm worried about them popping out of the pods. I'll have plenty of opportunities to get the beans out of the field. Well, then it started raining and snowing in some cases, and on my operation, we were waiting for ground to freeze. Waiting for snow to melt off of soybeans so that we could cut soybeans in late November and early December. That sucks, as you guys know that have done that. Now harvesting down corn sucks equally. So it's a tough decision to make sometimes. But ideally, we should cut soybeans the first time they're at 14.5 or 15%. If you've got a way to dry them down. The first time they're at 13 or 13.5% if you don't have a way to dry them down. And corn should come out probably in the low to mid 20s. So that's the ideal situation. We don't get ideal in a lot of cases, but as close as you can get to that, the better. And that is an argument for planting a range of maturities in both crops. So, I might tell you that 3, 6, and above soybeans give you the maximum yield potential. But if planting some late group 2s and early group 3s early gives you an extra month to harvest and means that you can cut more beans at the proper timing, you might gain back as much yield from harvest timing as you're losing from genetic yield potential of planting an earlier season bean. Same thing with corn. If you're planting some 105, 107, 108, 109 day corn, and that gives you the ability to harvest more corn at 20-ish% moisture versus planting the whole farm to 112, 113 day corn. You start at 28 and you end at 13. You got to start maybe higher than you wanted to, and you're still ending lower than you'd like to. So if we can get a wider range of maturities, that helps you manage that harvest moisture.
Hey, we're getting down to the end of it here. We're at 8:22, so we just got a few minutes left. Make sure you guys are getting your questions in. We had another question come in, kind of a follow-up question, if you will, in a way, from Dirt Doctorful, Lance.
All right, cool.
Says our area has had good growing conditions for beans. Why aren't I finding more 4-bean pods, and whatever happened to 5-bean pods?
That's a good question. I love that. So, I'll take the more serious question first. Is why am I not seeing more 4-bean pods? I'm going to say it's a little bit like what I mentioned on gray leaf spot. I don't quite know what it is in some areas that gray leaf spot didn't like about this year. Was it too dry in June? Was it too much rain in some cases? Little known fact, if it rains all day, every day, you won't ever have much gray leaf spot. So gray leaf spot needs wet, dry cycles. Was it, what was it about the environment this year in some areas that didn't favor gray leaf spot as much as I thought it would? I would say in the case of soybeans, I'm not sure there was any soybeans that weren't wetter than they wanted to be at some point in time during the growing season. Now, there may be some small areas that it wasn't so super saturated that the beans never look bad. The other thing that influences pod size is pod number. So, and this kind of relates to your 5-bean pod question. If you've got really heavy pod count, I wouldn't be super alarmed that I'm not seeing 4s. Although I do agree with you, generally when I open up that soybean canopy and I see some 4s, I always feel good about that. But the pod size doesn't really matter as much as the pod number. And that was absolutely the case with the 5-bean pod. We had a little fun with that a few years ago with, challenging people to find a 5-bean pod. And most plants with a 5-bean pod on them probably weren't all that great of a soybean plant. Because if you've got fewer pods, you're probably more likely to find that 5-beaner. And I did find one of those in my lifetime, and they are fun to find. But you cannot really increase the yield of soybeans by increasing the number of seeds per pod. The way you drive yield in soybeans is pods per plant, not seeds per pod. So the focus with soybean breeding is to turn more flowers into a pod. I don't really care whether I don't want a bunch of 1 and 2 bean pods, but I don't really care whether it's a 3 or a 4. If you want to stick a 5 on there, that's fine. But the way we're going to drive yield in soybeans is more pods and filling the seed that's in those pods. If you got a bunch of 4s that abort back to a 3, you might as well have started with a 3. I'm going to say there's something in the environment. I don't know what it was in your case, but something in the environment could have been sunlight. We've talked about sunlight several times. I mean, the last, a lot of people don't realize this, but at London Mills, Illinois, can't say this for everybody, but at my house, the last day I had full sunlight was like May 26th or 29th. So we've either been rainy, cloudy, or smoky, hazy, or both since the 1st of June. So June is our best sunlight month of the year. And our best sunlight month of the year, a lot of people had a lot of rainy days. And then since July got here, which is our second best sunlight month of the year, we've had a lot of hazy days. And could that be a factor that's keeping that seed count per pod down a little bit? I don't know, but I do agree with you that it is a little bit concerning not to see some 4s, because that's just kind of one of those rules of thumb that if you're seeing lots of 4s, that means things have been pretty good. And if you're seeing primarily 2s and 3s, you can still have good yielding beans. You might have just as good a yield, but it is kind of an indication that plant hasn't been loving life quite as much as maybe it could have.
Thanks again there, Doctor, for the questions and interaction. We always like to get questions from people.
Yeah.
It makes it interesting.
He deserves a better answer to good questions than the one I just gave him.
I think last thing, we just got about 3 minutes left here, Lance. I'd like to remind everybody, if you got any questions, you'd like to get more notifications and not have to remember all this timing as far as when we do Ask the Agronomist. We try to do it every other week, so on a 2-week schedule. But if you want to have a easier way to do that, make sure you subscribe to the channel, the YouTube channel. We're on Twitter as well. and Facebook. So there's a lot of different ways to get that information from us and be notified. And probably the best way for our YouTube live interaction is to subscribe to our channel. And when you subscribe, right next to the subscribe button, there's a little bell notification. If you hit that bell and say you'd like to be notified all the time, it'll pop up as long as you got the settings and your phone set that way. It'll give you a notification when we start Ask the Agronomist again. So always like to have good interaction with everybody in our footprint in our area. Appreciate it.
Speaking of that, we will, I think 2 weeks from today will be August 26th, I believe. Adam, is that right?
That's correct.
So August 26th will be our next Ask the Agronomist. And I already know we're going to be live on location at our Roanoke, Illinois focus site. So shout out to Jason Carr and the crew at our TD focus site in Roanoke, Illinois. They are going to do 2 days of open houses there, the 26th and 27th of August. So if you want to see short corn, if you want to see Smart Stacks Pro, if you want to see a lot of the stuff in the pipeline and some really good research that they're doing there at Roanoke, talk to your FSR about getting scheduled to go to one of those open houses. And I'm going to be there with my team next 2 weeks from today. So we're going to do our next Ask the Agronomist from Roanoke.
Awesome. Well, we're right at 8:29. So unless you got anything else you want to hit on today, Lance, I don't see any more questions coming in at the moment.
Okay. Well, that's good. We don't need to drag it out any longer. Appreciate the participation today. Love the live chat questions. Thanks for that. I would really, it's always been my dream that we get enough interaction with the live audience that Adam and I don't have to think up of things to talk about. We've proven pretty well now that we can think up of things to talk about. But appreciate the questions. Really love the interaction, and I just think it would be a better quality product if we get more people that are chatting in live questions, and Adam and I can play off of those live questions. So really love those of you who take the time to do that. I appreciate everybody logging in today. Everybody be safe and enjoy the cooler weather coming up here, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
I should ask you again to